He pulled a stranger out of a blizzard. She was unconscious, bleeding, barely breathing. He carried her 2 miles through waist-deep snow in -20 degrees because leaving her there was never an option. He didn't know her name, didn't know her face, didn't ask for anything in return. He just did it, the way he'd always done things, quietly, without fanfare, without expecting the world to notice. But here's the part that will stop you cold. The woman he saved that night? She was already scheduled to walk into his workplace the very next morning and sign the papers that would end his career forever. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Because this channel is where ordinary people carry extraordinary weight, and the stories we tell will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from tonight. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because what happens next is going to take your breath away. The storm came in fast, the way bad things usually do in Montana, without much warning and with absolutely no mercy. By 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening in late January, the temperature outside Dillon had dropped to -18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was doing something ugly off the Bitterroot Range, driving sheets of ice crystal snow horizontally across Highway 91 in near whiteout conditions. The state had issued a travel advisory 3 hours earlier. Most people with any common sense had already pulled off the road. Cole Maddox was not most people, and common sense had never been the thing that kept him alive. He drove a 12-year-old Ford F-250 that had seen better decades, dented quarter panels, a cracked passenger side mirror held on with electrical tape, tires that had more miles on them than he was comfortable admitting. The heater worked, barely, and the defroster on the rear window had stopped functioning sometime around Halloween. He kept a scraper on the seat beside him for that reason. He also kept a go-bag behind the driver's seat, a wool blanket, a first aid kit, 2 chemical hand warmers, a flashlight, a folding knife, and a half-liter of water that was probably half frozen by now. He'd carried some version of that bag for 15 years, a habit so deeply embedded in him that he no longer thought about it consciously. It was just part of how he moved through the world. He was heading home from the late shift at Hartwell Manufacturing, 45 minutes outside of Dillon, out on the industrial flats where the factory sat like a gray brick against the landscape. He worked nights? Had worked nights for going on 3 years, because nights meant he could be home when his daughter woke up in the morning, could walk her to the bus stop, could be there for the stuff that mattered. The shift ran 7 p.m. to 3 a.m., maintenance and mechanical. He was good at it. Not because anyone particularly noticed, but because machines didn't lie to you and problems didn't play politics. You either fixed something or you didn't. His daughter's name was Ellie. She was 7 years old and currently asleep at their neighbor Mrs. Paulson's house 2 miles down the county road, which is where she slept on the nights Cole worked late. Mrs. Paulson was 71, moved slow, and made the best elk stew in Beaverhead County. She and Cole had an arrangement that worked for both of them. He split her firewood twice a week and kept her ancient furnace running, and she watched Ellie with the kind of focused attention that only retired school teachers seemed capable of. Cole thought about Ellie now, the way he always did on the drive home. The particular way she'd looked that morning at breakfast, both elbows on the table, completely absorbed in a library book about deep-sea creatures. She'd told him very seriously that anglerfish were proof that the ocean was mostly terrifying. He'd told her she wasn't wrong. She'd smiled at that, gap-toothed and unguarded, and it was the kind of moment he kept in his chest like a coal, something warm he could press a hand against when things got cold. He almost missed it. The skid marks on the snow-packed highway were already half buried, and the guardrail damage was hidden in shadow. What caught his eye was the faintest smear of red, a taillight reflection off the snowfield below the embankment, there and gone in the sweep of his headlights. He'd driven past it by 40 yards before his brain finished processing what his eyes had seen. He hit the brakes. The truck shimmied, grabbed, held. He sat there for 2 full seconds with the engine idling and the wipers slapping back and forth. Then he pulled onto the shoulder, grabbed the flashlight, and got out. The cold hit him the way it always did. Not gradually, but all at once, like stepping through a wall. He'd spent winters in places that made Montana feel reasonable, but that didn't mean he'd ever gotten comfortable with it. He zipped his Carhartt jacket to the collar, pulled the wool hat down over his ears, and moved to the edge of the embankment. Below, maybe 60 feet down a slope of frozen scrub and snow, a black luxury SUV sat on its side against a stand of scrub pine. The passenger side windows faced up toward the sky. One of the rear tires was still spinning slowly. The vehicle had rolled. He could see the furrow it had cut down the slope, could see where it had clipped a boulder and torqued sideways. Steam or smoke was rising from somewhere near the engine. "Hey!" He shouted it into the wind, and the wind threw it back at him. Nothing moved down there. No interior lights, no sound beyond the wind and the ticking of that cooling engine. Cole went back to the truck, grabbed the go bag and the wool blanket, and then he went down the slope. He didn't run. Running on an iced slope in the dark was how you broke an ankle. But he moved as fast as he could trust his footing, angling across the grade, testing each step before committing his weight. He'd done this kind of thing enough times that the mechanics of it were automatic. His mind was already elsewhere, already calculating, already sorting through what he might find. The SUV was a late-model Cadillac Escalade, black, the kind that cost more than he earned in 2 years. The driver's side was buried in snow and pine branches. He went around to the passenger side, which was now facing upward, and shone the flashlight in through the window. She was in the driver's seat, or what had been the driver's seat before gravity and physics had rearranged everything. She was hanging sideways in her seatbelt, unconscious, her dark hair fallen across her face. 30s, maybe. Dressed in a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, neither of which was going to do anything meaningful against the cold. A laptop bag had slid up against the dashboard. There was a thin cut on her temple, not deep, but bleeding steadily the way head wounds do, more drama than danger if he was reading it right. She was breathing. He confirmed that first the way he'd been trained to confirm it, watching her chest, watching the faint frost cloud at her lips. Breathing. Good. "Hey!" He tapped the window with his knuckles. "Hey, can you hear me?" Nothing. Out cold. He tried the passenger door, locked, and the frame was warped anyway from the roll. He went back around to the driver's side, dug through the snow and branches with his hands until he got to the driver's window and put the butt of the flashlight through it. The tempered glass crazed and collapsed inward. Cold air flooded the cabin. Getting her out was slow, ugly work. The seatbelt was jammed. Yes, he had to use the knife to cut it, sawing through the webbing one-handed while he supported her weight with the other arm. She made a small sound when he shifted her, a sharp exhale that wasn't quite a word, and he said, "Easy, easy. I've got you," the same way he'd said it in places he didn't think about anymore, to people he couldn't save and people he could. She came free. He caught her both arms, and she was dead weight, completely limp, head against his shoulder. He checked her neck quickly, as carefully as he could with numb fingers, feeling for anything that shouldn't be there. Nothing obvious. No deformity, no crepitus. She was alive and she was intact, and the SUV had started making a new sound, a low groaning from somewhere in the chassis that he didn't like at all. He picked her up and he started moving. Going back up the slope with a full-grown woman in your arms, in -18 degrees, in the dark, in a blizzard. Cole did not think about whether it was possible. He thought about footing. He thought about not going down. He thought about the angle of the slope and where the ice was likely to be worst, and which sections of snow were deep enough to give him purchase. He thought about her breathing, which he could feel against his neck, steady but shallow. He thought about whether the vehicle below them was going to do something dramatic in the next 2 minutes. It took him 11 minutes to get to the top of the embankment. He knew because he counted his breathing, a habit from training, from the long swims and the long marches, from learning how to turn pain into arithmetic. By the time he reached the guardrail, his legs were burning and his shoulders felt like someone had driven screws into them. He set her down in the lee of the truck, out of the worst of the wind, and crouched over her. Her lips were starting to show the early blue of cold stress. Not full hypothermia, not yet, but the clock was moving. He'd called 911 before going down the slope, had made the call with stiff fingers, gotten a dispatcher who told him. Roads were closed across the county. Emergency services stretched thin, estimated response time 45 minutes minimum. He'd thanked her and hung up and gone down the slope anyway, because 45 minutes was a long time. Now he looked at the highway in both directions. Empty. The snow was coming harder. He thought about the Garrison cabin. Earl Garrison had retired to Phoenix 3 years back and left his property sitting empty. Cole did some occasional maintenance on it to keep the pipes from freezing, a casual arrangement, and he had a key on his ring. The cabin was 3/4 of a mile up a Forest Service road that turned off the highway about 200 yards ahead. It wasn't ideal, but ideal wasn't on tonight's menu. Cole loaded her into the truck, ran the heater full blast, called Mrs. Paulson to check on Ellie. Mrs. Paulson answered on the second ring and told him Ellie was fine, fast asleep, stop worrying, and then he drove those 200 yards and turned onto the Forest Service road. The cabin was dark and cold when they arrived, but it was solid. He'd been up here in November, replaced a broken window latch and checked the propane tank, which had been 3/4 full. He got her inside first, then went back for the go bag and the blanket. The wood stove took him 4 minutes to get going, using the small stack of split wood beside the hearth. He was grateful, in the wordless way of practical people, that he'd replenished that stack when he was here in November. He got her onto the old couch near the stove, elevated her legs slightly with a folded blanket, and wrapped her in the wool blanket. He cleaned the cut on her temple with water from his half-frozen bottle and a strip of cloth torn from his undershirt. It had stopped bleeding on its own, which was a good sign. Her color was coming back slowly. Her breathing was steadying. He sat on the floor beside the couch and watched the fire. She came around slowly, the way people come back from cold. Not all at once, but in pieces. First the small, restless movements, then a deeper breath. Then the eyes. They were dark brown, those eyes. She looked at the ceiling first, then the fire, then him. She didn't scream. He respected that. Where? Her voice was rough, her throat dry. She swallowed, tried again. Where am I? A friend's cabin, Cole said. Garrison Place, off 91. You went off the road. Your vehicle rolled. She absorbed this. Her hand went to the side of her head, found the makeshift bandage. She pulled it away and looked at it without much expression. You did this? She said. The cut was already there. I cleaned it up. She was quiet for a moment. The fire popped and settled. Outside, the wind was doing serious things to the eaves. I remember the road, she said slowly. The car started sliding. I turned into it, and then she stopped. Then nothing. Black ice under fresh snow, Cole said. Common on that stretch. You took it at highway speed. How long was I out there? Don't know exactly. Long enough. He paused. You need to warm up gradually. Don't try to move around too much yet. Paramedics are going to be a while. Roads are all closed. She looked at him with something careful in her expression, assessing. Who are you? She asked. He thought about how to answer that, which was something he still wasn't great at, even after all this time. Cole Maddox, he said. I work maintenance out at Hartwell Manufacturing. I was driving home when I spotted your vehicle. Something moved in her face when he said the name of the company. Quick, like a window shade pulled down. Gone before he could read it properly. Vivian, she said. Vivian Hale. She didn't offer a hand. She was still wrapped in the blanket, her fingers probably only recently functional again. And he didn't push for one. They sat in the relative warmth of the cabin with the storm working itself into a fury outside, and the fire doing what fires have always done in places like this. You have family? She asked after a while. She wasn't making conversation. The question had more weight to it than that. Daughter? Cole said. 7. She's with a neighbor tonight. Vivian looked at the fire. She's lucky, she said, almost to herself. Cole didn't answer that. He reached over and added another piece of wood to the stove instead. They didn't talk much after that, which suited him fine. He stayed awake. She drifted in and out, not unconscious again, he was fairly sure, just exhausted, body shutting down the unnecessary functions to focus on getting warm. Around 2 in the morning, the wind dropped a degree or two. Around 3, the snow lightened. By 4:15, headlights swept across the frost-covered window. The paramedics, finally, bumping up the Forest Service road in a 4-wheel drive rig. Cole met them at the door, gave them the rundown in the clipped shorthand of a person who's relayed medical information before. Vital signs, timeline, the nature of the impact, her current status, the temperature exposure. One of the paramedics, a young woman with tired eyes, gave him a look somewhere between gratitude and professional curiosity. You family? She asked. No, Cole said. You do this kind of thing often? He stepped back and let them work. That was answer enough. They wanted to take Vivian to the hospital in Dillon for observation. Vivian, sitting up now with her color back and her expression considerably more composed than someone had any right to be after rolling a $60,000 SUV down a mountainside, looked at Cole across the cabin. Thank you, she said. Cole. She said it the way you say a name when you want to make sure you remember it. I mean that. Drive slower on black ice, he told her. He wasn't trying to be funny. He was just stating fact. But she almost smiled at it, small, genuine, involuntary, before the paramedics helped her out the door. Cole sat in the empty cabin for a little while after they left, listening to the storm. The fire was still going. The couch still held the impression of where she'd been lying. He thought about Ellie asleep at Mrs. Paulson's, and about the fact that he still had to go home and change before his next shift started in less than 16 hours. He thought about Vivian Hale, the way something had shifted in her face when he'd said Hartwell Manufacturing. He filed that away the way he filed most things that didn't quite add up. Not forgotten, just set aside, in a mental drawer he'd get back to when there was time. He put out the fire safely, locked the cabin, and walked out into the gray pre-dawn air. The storm had burned itself out. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, pale and cold and very clear, the way skies always looked after violence, whether the violence was weather or something else. He stood beside the truck for a moment and breathed the sharp, clean air, feeling the deep muscular fatigue in his legs and shoulders without particularly minding it. Then he got in, started the engine, and drove home to his daughter. Cole got home at 5:17 in the morning. The county road was passable again. The plows had been through sometime in the last hour, pushing the snow into dirty gray ridges along the shoulders. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the truck for a moment with the engine running and the heater on, looking at the house. It was a small place, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom with a temperamental water heater, a kitchen that got cold in the corners no matter how well he'd recaulked the windows. He'd rented it for 3 years and had fixed more things in it than the landlord knew about, because the landlord lived in Butte and charged fair rent, and Cole figured that made them even. He got inside, pulled off his boots at the door, and stood in the kitchen in his socks. His shoulders ached in a specific, deep way that he associated with carrying weight over distance. A feeling he hadn't missed exactly, but recognized without surprise, like running into someone he used to know. He drank 2 glasses of water standing at the sink, ate 4 crackers with peanut butter because it was all he had the appetite for, and then he sat down at the kitchen table and let himself be tired for a few minutes. The name surfaced again, Vivian Hale, the way she'd looked at him when he'd said Hartwell Manufacturing, not recognition, or not quite, something faster than that, something she'd caught and put away before he could get a proper look at it. He'd been around enough people running controlled reactions to know when someone was working to keep their face neutral. She was good at it, but the training that had made him useful in places nobody talked about had also made him a decent reader of the space between what people showed and what they felt. It probably meant nothing. It likely meant nothing. He went to bed at 5:40 and set his alarm for 10:30. He needed to pick up Ellie from Mrs. Paulson's by noon, and he had a shift starting again at 7 p.m., which gave him a window that was going to feel shorter than it looked on paper. He slept without dreaming, which was the best kind of sleep he knew. Ellie was waiting at Mrs. Paulson's front door when he pulled up, already in her coat and backpack, her dark hair in 2 uneven pigtails that she'd clearly done herself. She launched herself off the porch steps before he'd fully stopped the truck, and he caught her the way he always caught her, both arms, no hesitation, swinging her up against his chest. "You smell like smoke," she informed him. "Good morning to you, too." "Were you in a fire?" "I used a wood stove last night." He set her down. "Long story." She looked at him with the particular expression she used when she was deciding whether to push further or accept the answer. She was 7, but she had the instincts of someone considerably older, had learned somewhere along the way that there were things her father dealt with quietly and that asking too many questions about them wasn't going to get her much. He wasn't sure whether that made him proud or sad. Probably both. "Can we have pancakes?" she asked. "We can have pancakes." Mrs. Paulson appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy cardigan, and gave Cole the look she gave him every time he came home from a long night. The look that was somewhere between maternal concern and the kind of acceptance that came from having lived long enough to stop being surprised by much. "There was something on the local news this morning," she said, "about a vehicle that went off 91 last night. A woman rescued." Cole zipped Ellie's jacket the rest of the way up. "Cold out," he said. Mrs. Paulson studied him for a moment. "You need to eat more," she said, which was her way of saying she understood, and also her way of saying she loved him, and they both knew it. He thanked her, got Ellie into the truck, and drove home. They made pancakes. Ellie ate 4 of them with maple syrup that she poured with the focused generosity of someone who'd never been told to worry about sugar. And Cole ate 2 and drank his coffee and watched her across the table. She told him about a book Mrs. Paulson had given her, something about horses in the old American West, and she told him that her friend Daisy at school had gotten a hamster, and she told him very seriously that she wanted a hamster too, but that she understood if they couldn't have one right now. Right now was her phrase for the state of their finances, which she'd absorbed from context without ever being explicitly told. He both appreciated and hated that about her. "Let me think about it," he said. "That's what you said about the fish." And we got the fish. The fish died, Dad. The fish died. But we had it. She considered this with great seriousness and then appeared to decide it was an acceptable philosophical position because she went back to her pancakes. Cole drank his coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the snow that the storm had left was brilliant in the late morning sun, the kind of white that made you squint even through glass. It was the sort of morning that made Montana look like a postcard rather than the complicated, demanding, frequently brutal landscape it actually was. He got Ellie set up with her homework at the kitchen table around 1 o'clock, and he went to the back room and pulled up his work email on his laptop, an ancient machine that ran slowly and had a cracked hinge on the lid that he'd fixed with a binder clip. There were 3 emails from Hartwell Manufacturing. 2 of them were routine. The third was a company-wide notification dated 2 days ago, addressed to all staff. He read it twice. Hartwell Manufacturing was pleased to announce the appointment of a new chief executive officer, effective immediately. The new CEO would be conducting a full operational review of all facilities, including an in-person inspection of the Dillon plant, scheduled for tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. The CEO's name was listed at the bottom of the email: Vivian Hale. Cole sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. The binder clip on his laptop lid caught the light and threw a small bright point onto the wall across from him. He thought about the way she'd gone still, just briefly, when he'd said the name of his workplace. Not surprised exactly. She'd already known. She'd been processing something else in that moment. He wasn't sure what. He got up, checked on Ellie, deep in long division, pencil eraser working overtime, and went to the kitchen to make another cup of coffee he didn't particularly need. He arrived at work at 6:40, 20 minutes early, which was his habit. The parking lot was fuller than usual for a Thursday. There were vehicles he didn't recognize, a black rental sedan and 2 SUVs, which meant the corporate people had already arrived and were already doing whatever corporate people did in conference rooms before the actual work of inspecting things began. He checked in at the security desk, nodded to Hartwell's overnight security guard, a quiet man named Dennis who'd worked the desk for 12 years and communicated primarily through eyebrow movements, and went to the maintenance bay to start his pre-shift check. The Dillon plant was a mid-sized manufacturing facility, primarily industrial components, hydraulic systems for heavy equipment, some contract work for agricultural machinery manufacturers. It employed about 230 people directly, with another 60 or so contracted. Cole knew the building the way he knew very few things, intimately, imperfectly, with an ongoing awareness of its particular weaknesses and the history of every patch and repair that had been made or not made over the years. He'd started filing maintenance reports with concerns about certain systems about 18 months ago. The pressure regulation system in the primary production wing had been showing behavioral inconsistencies, small things, the kind of things that didn't show up clearly in automated monitoring unless you knew what you were looking at, but that added up to a pattern that troubled him. He'd filed the reports through the proper channels. He'd gotten acknowledgments. He'd never gotten action. His supervisor, a man named Gary Britton, was the kind of manager who was very good at making problems disappear on paper. Gary had been at Hartwell for 22 years and had developed, over that time, a sophisticated understanding of how to route information upward in ways that minimized inconvenience to the people above him. Cole had learned this about Gary gradually and had adjusted his expectations accordingly, and had continued filing his reports because at the end of the day, his name was on them, and he wasn't willing to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. He was in the middle of checking the hydraulic line connections in Section 4 when he heard the click of heels on the concrete floor behind him, an unusual sound in a manufacturing facility where everyone wore steel-toed boots or heavy shoes. He turned around. Vivian Hale was standing at the entrance to Section 4 with a tablet in her hand and two men in suits behind her. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer, different from the one she'd been wearing last night, but the same general register, and her dark hair was pulled back. The cut on her temple had been covered with a small flesh-toned bandage, barely visible. Her posture was perfectly composed, the way it had been when she'd looked at him across the paramedic's shoulders at 4:15 this morning. She saw him at the same moment he turned. Cole watched the recognition move across her face, quick, controlled, not quite suppressed. Her chin lifted slightly. She recovered in about 3 seconds, which was faster than most people could manage. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the hydraulic connection he'd been checking. "Section 4, one of the suits said to her, reading from something on his own tablet. "This is the primary hydraulic assembly area. Maintenance is handled by—" He checked his screen. "Cole Maddox, night shift." "I'm aware of who handles maintenance," Vivian said. Her voice was even, professional. The kind of voice that had clearly been used in a lot of rooms where being the youngest person and the only woman meant you had to be twice as sure before you opened your mouth. She walked into the section. The two suits stayed at the entrance. Cole straightened up from where he'd been crouched and turned to face her. She stopped about 4 feet away and looked at him with an expression that gave away very little. "Mr. Maddox," she said. "Ms. Hale," he said. A beat of silence. Not uncomfortable exactly. More like the kind of silence that acknowledges there are things in it that neither party is going to address right now. "How's the shoulder?" he asked. Her eyes registered that. A brief flicker of something that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it. "Fine," she said. "How's yours?" "Works fine." She glanced at the hydraulic lines he'd been examining. "What are you checking?" He told her. He told her plainly and specifically. The pressure inconsistency he'd noticed, the pattern over 18 months, the reports he'd filed, the intervals at which the readings drifted before resetting. He spoke the way he always spoke about mechanical problems, without embellishment, without editorializing, just facts and sequence and what the facts suggested. She listened. That surprised him. Not that she stood there and let him talk, but that she was actually listening. Her eyes were on the equipment, not on him, and she was processing what he said rather than waiting for him to finish. "And the reports went to Britain," she said. "All of them." "What did Britain tell you?" "That the monitoring system was showing normal readings and not to worry about it." She wrote something on her tablet. Cole couldn't see what. "Thank you, Mr. Maddox," she said in the tone that clearly meant the conversation was over. She walked back toward the two suits. Cole watched her go and then turned back to the hydraulic lines, because the hydraulic lines were actually his concern and didn't resolve themselves by being observed. He heard her say something to the suits, low enough that he couldn't make out the words, and heard one of the suits say, in the slightly too loud voice of someone accustomed to being the one who summarized things, "Routine maintenance concerns. Night shift staff tend to over-report. It's a documentation instinct." Cole kept his hands on the machinery and his face neutral. He worked the rest of the night methodically, moving through his rotation. He saw Vivian twice more in the facility, once in the secondary production area, speaking with a group of engineers in a way that seemed to involve the engineers doing more nodding than talking, and once near the control room where she stood for a long time looking at the monitoring display while the plant's operations manager, a man named Dennis Farrow, explained things to her with the over-patient tone of someone who had decided she probably didn't understand what she was looking at. Cole noticed, because noticing things was how he was built, that she asked Farrow several questions that made him visibly less comfortable than he'd been a moment before. Around 10:30, during his break, he was sitting in the maintenance break room with a cup of coffee and a ham sandwich when Gary Britton came in. Gary was a broad, pink-faced man of 54 who had the specific energy of someone who'd spent decades making sure nothing was technically his fault. "Management's making the rounds," Gary said, in the way he said everything, as if sharing a confidence. "I noticed," Cole said. "New CEO's here, young woman, corporate type." Gary poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. "You talked to her?" "She came through Section 4. Gary's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "What did you two talk about?" "The pressure system anomalies in Section 4. Gary set his coffee cup down with slightly more care than the action required. "Cole, those reports are documented," Cole said, "with dates. Gary looked at him for a moment with the expression he used when he was calculating something. It wasn't an unfriendly expression. Gary didn't deal in unfriendly. He dealt in managed, which was somehow worse. The monitoring system shows normal, Gary said. The monitoring system shows what it's calibrated to show, Cole said. I've said that in every report. The engineers have reviewed. Which engineers? Gary stopped. He picked up his coffee again. The important thing, he said, with the careful tone of someone landing a plane, is that production stays on schedule. There's a board review coming up. The company's in a sensitive position right now with the acquisition talks, and I'm aware of the board review, Cole said. I'm not aware of how that's relevant to pressure system maintenance. Gary looked at him. Cole ate his sandwich. There was nothing hostile in the exchange, just two men who understood each other clearly and disagreed about what that meant. I'm just saying, Gary said, that it's not a great time to make noise. I'm not making noise, Cole said. I'm doing my job. Gary left without finishing his coffee. Cole sat alone in his break room for another 4 minutes, finished his sandwich, drank the rest of his coffee, and went back to work. It was back in Section 4 at 11:15, running a manual pressure test on the secondary line when he became aware of someone standing at the section entrance again. He looked up. Vivian was alone this time. No suits, no tablet. She had a small notebook, actual paper, which surprised him, and a pen. She walked in without asking permission, which he found he didn't mind. The operations manager tells me the pressure readings in Section 4 have been consistently within acceptable parameters for the past 6 months, she said. The operations manager would know what the digital readings say, Cole agreed. She looked at him. You're saying the digital readings are wrong. I'm saying the digital readings reflect what the sensors are calibrated to capture. If the sensors have calibration drift, or if they're positioned to miss a specific type of pressure fluctuation, the readings can look clean while the actual system is building toward a failure. And you believe that's what's happening? I believe it's possible, Cole said. I've documented 18 months of behavioral inconsistencies that I can't explain any other way. I've requested independent sensor recalibration twice. Both requests were declined. She wrote something in the notebook. He noticed she wrote in clear, fast handwriting, print, not cursive, the kind of handwriting that was purely functional and had given up caring about elegance. Why haven't you escalated past Britain? She asked. It was a fair question. He thought about how to answer it honestly without making it sound like a grievance. I did once, he said, 14 months ago. Sent a summary to the plant operations director, Farrow. Got a response from Britain 2 days later telling me to keep concerns in the proper chain of command. He paused. Which is its own answer. She looked at him then, a longer look than she'd given him yet tonight, something evaluative in it, and beneath that something he couldn't quite categorize. The cabin, she said. It wasn't quite a question. What about it? You told me you worked maintenance. You didn't mention anything about this. Didn't seem like the place, he said. You were hypothermic. The corner of her mouth moved. I was not hypothermic. You were early stage hypothermic. Your lips were blue. She didn't argue it. She looked at the pressure line he'd been testing. What would you need to prove the calibration issue? She asked. Independent physical inspection of the pressure sensors, a certified engineer who doesn't work for Hartwell, and access to the maintenance request logs from the last 2 years, which I've been told don't exist in a consolidated format. He let that last part sit for a moment. She wrote it down. All of it. Thank you, Mr. Maddox, she said again. Cole, he said. Not flirtatious, just practical. They'd spent a night in a cabin together, even if the circumstances had been purely survival. Mr. felt ridiculous. She considered this for half a second. Cole, she said, and then she left. He went back to the pressure test. His hands were steady. The line was not behaving the way it should. The inspection ran until 2 in the morning. Cole's shift ended at 3, and he spent the last hour doing the documentation that Gary had never quite managed to make him stop doing, detailed, time-stamped, specific. Every anomaly, every reading, every observation. Filed through the system where they'd sit in their little digital folders, properly logged, properly ignored. Or perhaps not ignored. That was new. He thought about Vivian Hale in that boardroom at 8 in the morning, 4 hours from now, presenting her findings to whatever group of executives had been waiting for her report. He thought about what those executives would do with the information she brought them. And he thought about the acquisition talks Gary had mentioned, and the board review, and the layered, comfortable architecture of institutional neglect that had been humming along undisturbed in this facility for what was probably longer than anyone in a suit wanted to think about. He thought about the 230 people who worked here. Most of them were people like him. Nobody's story, just people doing a job, trying to make the thing work. He clocked out at 3:02, nodded to Dennis at the security desk, and walked out into the January cold. The sky above the parking lot was absolute black and full of stars. The kind of sky you only got in places far enough from city lights, clear and cold and enormous. He stood beside his truck for a moment and let the air clear his head. He was not a person who hoped for things he couldn't control. He'd learned that early and learned it the hard way, the way most lessons worth keeping were learned. But he let himself notice, standing there in the dark, that someone had listened tonight. That for the first time in 18 months, someone had written things down. That didn't fix anything. It didn't recalibrate a sensor, or reroute a pressure system, or undo 12 years of slow institutional decay. But it was something. He got in the truck and drove home to his daughter. What Cole didn't know, couldn't have known, sitting in his truck on that frozen parking lot, was what had happened in the executive wing of the facility between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., after Vivian had left Section 4 with her paper notebook and her careful handwriting. She'd gone directly to the server room with one of her people, a young woman named Priya, who handled data architecture and who had the specific talent of finding things that organizations didn't realize they'd failed to properly delete. They'd spent 90 minutes in there. Priya had found the consolidated maintenance logs inside 45 minutes. They existed. They'd always existed. They'd been filed in a folder structure that required a specific set of access permissions that maintenance staff didn't have. Vivian had stood over Priya's shoulder and read the logs for the remaining 45 minutes in silence, with the expression she wore when she was making decisions that were going to be expensive for someone. She'd also pulled Cole Maddox's personnel file. She didn't know why exactly. Professional instinct, or something less professional, or something she wasn't ready to name yet. The file was short on the kind of history she'd expected. Before Hartwell, there was a gap of almost 2 years. Before the gap, military service. But the specifics were sparse in a way that suggested the record had been deliberately thinned. The gap was the kind that meant someone had taken time to figure out who they were when the thing that had defined them was gone. She'd looked at the file for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she'd closed it and gone back to the maintenance logs and gotten back to work. The plant hummed around her, indifferent and intricate, full of systems that were either working properly or weren't, and full of people who were either paying attention or had been convinced that not paying attention was the safer option. She thought about a man she'd never expected to see again, standing in Section 4 in his Hartwell coveralls with grease on his hands and 18 months of documented evidence that nobody had wanted to hear, speaking to her with the specific flatness of someone who'd learned a long time ago that volume didn't improve an argument. She thought about blue lips in a dark cabin and a wood stove burning and a voice that had said, "Easy, easy, I've got you," in the dark, with the snow coming down outside. She picked up her notebook and went to find the operations director. Dennis Farrow was not going to enjoy the next 30 minutes, but that was no longer her concern. 3 days passed before Cole heard anything. In that window, 3 days of normal shifts, normal pre-dawn drives home, normal breakfasts with Ellie, normal evenings of homework and bad television and early bedtimes. The facility ran the way it always ran. Production schedules posted. Safety briefings attended. Equipment checked, logged, moved on from. Gary Britton moved through the plant with his usual unhurried authority, stopping to talk to people in the way he always did, easy and familiar, the kind of man who'd been somewhere long enough that the place had shaped itself around him like water around a stone. Cole worked and watched and said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say. Vivian Hale was not in the building. Her inspection had ended. She'd returned to wherever CEOs returned to. Hartwell's corporate headquarters were in Denver, and he imagined she had other facilities to review, other problems to prioritize, an entire company's worth of things demanding her attention. He didn't think about her more than he thought about any other unresolved variable, which is to say, he thought about her at odd moments. Over coffee, standing over the hydraulic lines, once while watching Ellie do a jigsaw puzzle on the living room floor. Not because anything about the situation had the shape of something personal, but because unresolved variables were how his mind tended to categorize problems it hadn't finished processing. The maintenance logs existed. Someone had written things down. What happened next was not his to control. He focused on what was. On the fourth day, a Tuesday, just past midnight, about 3 hours into his shift, something changed in the sound of the plant. It was subtle. The kind of thing you'd miss if you were somewhere else mentally, or if you'd never spent enough time in a building's mechanical guts to understand its particular vocabulary of creaks and hums and rhythmic ticking. Cole was in the main corridor between Section 4 and Section 6 when he heard it. A change in the pitch of the pressure system's ambient tone, low and persistent, a half step flatter than it should have been. Like a note played on a piano where the string was just slightly wrong. He stopped walking. Around him, the facility continued its nighttime operations. Reduced crew, automated systems running their cycles, the distant sound of the packaging line in Section 7 doing its repetitive work. Nothing looked wrong. The overhead lights were steady. The monitoring panels on the walls displayed their familiar grids of green indicators. Cole stood still and listened. There it was again. Not a sound exactly, more of an absence. A particular kind of quiet inside the noise, which was its own kind of alarm if you knew how to hear it. He walked to the nearest wall panel and pulled up the pressure readings for the primary system. The numbers looked fine. They always looked fine. That was the problem he'd been writing reports about for a year and a half. He pulled out his personal gauge, a small analog device he carried in his tool bag, and had started carrying specifically because digital readings could be what they'd been calibrated to be, while an analog gauge just told you what was actually there. He located the nearest physical access point on the line, a junction coupling in the Section 4 to 6 corridor that was behind an access panel in the wall. He opened the panel and connected the gauge. The reading was 43 psi over the acceptable ceiling for this section of the system. He checked it again, same number. He stood there for maybe 4 seconds, which was not a long time, and was also plenty of time for a person who knew how to think fast in bad situations to build a fairly complete picture of what he was looking at. The primary pressure line that ran through Sections 4, 5, and 6 fed the hydraulic presses in the main production area. The presses were currently idle. It was past midnight, reduced crew. But the system was still pressurized, as it always was during non-peak hours, maintaining baseline pressure for the automated components. A failure at this pressure differential in this section of line, specifically at the junction couplings, which were the oldest components in the system and which he'd flagged for replacement 14 months ago, would not be a small event. The coupling would fail first. The pressure release would be sudden. Depending on where it went and how the adjacent systems responded, it could cascade. Cole did not spend time being angry about the 18 months of ignored reports. Anger was a thing you did when there was room for it. He went to the nearest emergency control station, the one on the east wall of the Section 4 corridor, the one closest to his current position, and he pulled the handle that shut down the primary production system. Alarms went off immediately. Not the catastrophic kind, the operational kind, the kind that said something has changed and people need to know. Red lights began cycling on the overhead panels. The packaging line in Section 7 went quiet. Cole's radio crackled. "Maddox, what the hell? This is Pharaoh. Did you just pull the Section 4 shutdown?" "Yes," Cole said into the radio. "On whose authority?" "Mine," Cole said. "We have a pressure differential of 43 over ceiling in the Section 4-6 corridor. I'm looking at the analog reading right now. The coupling at Junction 7 is the most likely failure point. If it goes, it'll take the adjacent line with it, and we're looking at a pressure event in a confined corridor with live hydraulic fluid." Silence on the radio. The kind of silence that had several things in it. "The digital monitoring shows normal," Pharaoh said. "I know what the digital monitoring shows," Cole said. "I have an analog gauge. Do you want the number again?" Another silence. Cole was already moving back down the corridor toward Junction 7 because knowing something was wrong and standing still about it weren't compatible activities. "Maddox, do not touch anything else until I get there. Do you understand me? You've already caused—" Cole set the radio down on the floor, not turning it off, just setting it aside so he could use both hands. He could hear Pharaoh's voice continuing to come out of it as he crouched in front of the access panel near Junction 7 and connected his gauge to the secondary coupling there. 61 over ceiling. That was worse than the first reading. The system had been building while they were talking. He stood up and began moving through the section, doing what needed to be done. Checking each coupling in sequence, tagging the ones with dangerous readings, assessing which parts of the system were most likely to fail first, and in what order. He'd done this kind of sequential assessment before, in different contexts, where the materials under pressure were more immediately lethal than hydraulic fluid, and the familiar mental state dropped over him without ceremony, clear, fast, without wasted motion. The Section 6 junction was the worst. He read the gauge there twice, and both times it said something he did not like, and he started calculating whether the Section 6 junction failing before the pressure could be safely bled off was a scenario they were in or approaching. He pulled his radio back up. "Pharaoh," he said, "I need someone to manually open the pressure relief valve at the main station. Not automated, manual. The automated system isn't registering the anomaly, so it's not going to release on its own. Maddox, I am telling you to stand down until we can assess." "There's a night crew in Section 7, Cole said. "If the Section 6 junction fails with them in there, they're going to be in a very bad situation. The manual relief valve is at the main control station on the north wall of Section 3. Someone needs to open it in the next few minutes." He didn't say, "or else." He didn't need to. There was a pause, and then a different voice came on the radio. One of the senior night operators, a man named Kevin, who Cole had worked alongside for 2 years. "I'll do it," Kevin said. "I'm 40 feet from the main station." "Thank you," Cole said, and meant it. "Open it to 60%. Don't full open it, controlled release." "Copy," Kevin said. Pharaoh's voice came back, colder now. "Maddox, you are going to have a significant—" Cole dropped the radio again. He was in Section 6, near the junction he'd flagged, when he heard the sound change again. Not a half-step flat this time. A different sound entirely. A strained metallic complaint from deep inside the wall cavity. The kind of sound that metal makes when it's been asked to do something it is no longer able to do. He had time to take 3 steps backward before the Section 6 junction coupling failed. The sound was enormous. Not an explosion in the movie sense, not a fireball, not a shockwave, but the hydraulic release of a high-pressure system in a confined space, which was loud and violent and immediate, a burst of pressurized fluid that blew the access panel off the wall entirely and sent it ricocheting off the ceiling and floor. The fluid hit the far wall of the corridor in a wide arc. The overhead lights in Section 6 flickered and then went out, replaced by the red emergency lighting, which turned everything the color of a darkroom. Cole was outside the direct path of the release. He'd known where to stand. That was not luck. That was 18 months of thinking carefully about exactly this kind of scenario. He stood in the red-lit corridor and heard the pressure in the line drop as Kevin, at the main station, opened the manual relief valve. The secondary coupling near Junction 6 was groaning but holding. The floor was wet with hydraulic fluid. The access panel had come to rest at the far end of the corridor. The radio, still on the floor a few yards back, was making noise. Multiple voices now. Cole took a long breath, then another. His heart was working, doing what hearts did in moments like this, but his hands were steady. They'd always been steady. It was one of the things he'd never been able to explain to anyone, how it was possible to have your body telling you all the things it told you in high-stress situations and still have steady hands. He didn't know the mechanism, he just knew it happened. He picked up the radio. "Section 6 junction has failed," he said, calm and factual. "Controlled failure. The manual relief is working. The floor is wet, so nobody runs in here. I need to walk the rest of the corridor to check the remaining junctions." Kevin's voice. "Manual relief is at 60%. Pressure is dropping on my gauge." "Good. Hold it there." Cole started walking. "Is Section 7 clear?" "Yeah, I sent everybody out when the alarm went. They're in the east parking lot." "Good." He moved through the corridor, checking each junction point, his flashlight cutting through the red-lit murk. One by one. This one, holding. That one showing stress fractures in the coupling ring. He flagged it, noted the position. The far junction, the last one in sequence, was intact. Stressed, but intact. He walked back toward the main corridor. What he found there was a different kind of problem. The blast from the junction failure, the panel that had blown off the wall, had done something unexpected on its way across the corridor. The mounting brackets from the access panel had caught the corner of a structural support column, and the impact had destabilized a section of the overhead ductwork that ran along the ceiling of the main corridor junction, the point where Section 6 connected to the central spine of the building. The ductwork was old. Cole had flagged it for inspection once, 2 years ago. A different report, a different ignored channel. And the brackets that secured it to the ceiling were not in the condition they should have been in. The ductwork was not falling, not yet, but it was moving in a way that ductwork should not move, a slow settling, and Cole could see the ceiling brackets pulling free of the concrete, one by one, incrementally, with the patience of inevitability. That was when he heard footsteps at the far end of the main corridor, high heels on concrete, moving fast. Cole had exactly enough time to think that's not possible before he saw her. Vivian was there. Coat, heels, the small notebook still somehow in her hand, hair loose, moving down the main corridor toward the Section 6 junction with the posture of someone who had heard alarms going off in a building and had walked toward them rather than away from them. Behind her, at a distance, one of her people, the young data woman, Priya, was trying to keep up and clearly losing. "Stop," Cole said. His voice carried the particular quality it had when he needed it to carry, and she stopped. "Don't come any further." Vivian looked at him across 30 feet of red-lit corridor. The floor between them was wet. Above her, the ductwork shifted slightly in the direction of her section of the ceiling. "What happened?" she said. "Section 6 junction failed. Get back to the east exit. There's a structural issue with the overhead ductwork, and I don't have confirmation on how stable it is." She looked up. He could see her assessing it. She wasn't the kind of person who took other people's assessments purely on trust, which under any other circumstances he'd respect. "Vivian." I used her name deliberately because ma'am and Ms. Hale were sounds you used in offices, and this was not an office situation. "The ceiling brackets are pulling. I don't know how much time we have, and I don't want to find out while you're standing under them." She looked at him. Something moved in her expression. Not fear exactly, more like the rapid recalculation of someone who was very smart and had just been given accurate information by a source she'd already assessed as reliable. She took 3 steps back toward the east end of the corridor. Then the ductwork came down. Not all of it. A 10-foot section, the section directly above the midpoint of the corridor, between where Cole was standing and where Vivian had been standing 30 seconds ago. It came down with a sound like a car wreck, metal on metal, dust and ceiling tile, and the sharp crack of a bracket giving way completely. And it hit the floor and bounced and came to rest at an angle, one end on the floor, one end still attached to the ceiling by one remaining bracket that Cole could see was not going to hold for long. The section that had fallen had landed between them. Cole went over it without thinking, not through it, over it, finding the highest stable point and clearing it in 2 steps, landing on the far side in the wet corridor. The remaining bracket above him popped and shrieked, and he moved fast to his left, away from the line of the ductwork. Vivian was against the wall. She wasn't hurt. The fallen section hadn't reached her, and she'd moved back far enough. But the corridor was now blocked behind her with the angled ductwork still partially suspended, and the section of ceiling above it was showing cracks in the plaster, which meant the structural issue was larger than the ductwork alone. Cole reached her in 4 steps. She was upright, both hands on the wall behind her, breathing fast but controlled. The notebook was still in her left hand. Her heels had 2 inches of hydraulic fluid on them. "Are you hurt?" he said, then. "No." Fast, decisive. "I'm not hurt." He looked at the ceiling. The remaining bracket was moving. "We need to go," he said. "There's an exit at the end of this corridor, the north emergency door." "I know where the north emergency door is," she said. "I toured this building this afternoon." He almost said something about the wisdom of touring a building that was actively failing, but they were already moving. He put himself between her and the damaged ceiling section as they went. Instinctive, not calculated. And she led him without comment, which told him she understood the geometry of the situation, even if she didn't like the implication. The north corridor was clear. Cole pushed the emergency door open, and the January cold hit them like a slap, vast and clean and indifferent, and they went through it. They stood outside in the parking lot on the north side of the building. The emergency lighting was painting everything in rotating amber. Several members of the night crew were clustered near the far fence. Someone had already called additional emergency services. Cole could hear sirens in the distance, moving closer. Vivian stood beside him. She was breathing hard. Not panicking. She wasn't built for panic, he was increasingly certain. but breathing the way you breathed when your body had used a lot of adrenaline and was working through the aftermath. She looked at the building. Then she looked at him. He was aware that he looked exactly how he looked. Worn Hartwell coveralls, grease on his forearms, hydraulic fluid on his boots, a flashlight still in his right hand. No particular composure to perform because he hadn't lost composure. It had just been what needed doing, done in the order it needed doing. "The relief valve," she said. Her voice was steady but had an edge of something underneath it, something working through what had almost been a different kind of night. "You called that before the junction failed." "Barely," he said, "but you called it." He didn't answer that. She looked at the building for another moment. From here they could see the north wing, and they could see that the lights in Section 6 were dark, and that there was no fire, no secondary event, the kind of thing that could have happened if the pressure release had gone differently, if there'd been a spark source near the fluid, if the cascade had hit the adjacent system instead of being bled off through the relief valve. "The crew from Section 7, she said. "They were in there when the alarm went off." "Kevin got them out," Cole said. "They were clear before the junction failed." She absorbed this with the expression she used when she was doing arithmetic that she didn't particularly enjoy the answer to. "If you hadn't shut down the production line, I don't know," Cole said, because he didn't, and speculating about the worst version of a scenario you'd avoided was not something he found useful. She turned and looked at him directly. In the amber emergency lighting, her face was pale and sharp, and completely without the professional composure she'd worn earlier in the evening, when she'd been the CEO doing a walkthrough with her notebook and her careful questions. "That's twice," she said. He understood what she meant. He didn't say anything. "You carried me through a blizzard," she said. "And tonight you—" She stopped, looked away briefly. When she looked back, her expression was controlled again, but the control cost her something. He could see that it cost her something. "I'm not very good at this," she said. "At what?" "At owing people things." He thought about that. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Both times I just did what needed doing." "That's not how it works," she said quietly. "That's exactly how it works," he said. They stood there in the cold, the two of them, while the sirens got closer and the emergency lights kept turning and the building behind them held together in the way that buildings held together after close calls. Not as a statement about resilience, just as a fact of physics, things remaining standing until they didn't. One of the suits, the older one, the one who'd been summarizing things during the inspection, appeared around the corner of the building at a fast walk, already reaching for his phone, already forming the opening lines of whatever narrative he was preparing to deliver to someone. He pulled up short when he saw Cole standing next to Vivian. "Ms. Hale," he said, slightly breathless. "Thank God. We didn't know where you were." "I'm here," Vivian said. "Get me Pharaoh and get me the safety director on a call in the next 10 minutes. "Of course. And regarding the shutdown of the production line, we'll discuss it inside," she said. "The initial assessment from Pharaoh is that the unauthorized shutdown caused—" "Kevin," Vivian said clearly. Kevin was the night operator who'd opened the relief valve, who was now standing 30 yards away near the cluster of Section 7 crew. She raised her voice just enough. "Kevin, the people from Section 7, they were all out before the junction failed?" Kevin looked over. "Yes, ma'am. All 12 of them." Vivian looked at the suit. The suit stopped talking. Cole watched this exchange with the sideways attention of someone who was genuinely tired and also genuinely interested in how certain kinds of rooms worked. He'd spent his military career inside systems that had their own architecture of authority, their own ways of deciding whose assessment counted and whose didn't. He'd gotten good at reading where the actual power was versus where it was performing itself. The suit walked back the way he'd come. Vivian watched him go, then looked at her notebook, which was somehow still intact and somehow still had dry pages despite everything that had happened in the last 25 minutes. "You should probably write a report," she said to Cole, in the tone of someone who understood exactly how much good reports had done him previously and was saying it anyway. "Already planning on it," he said. "I'd like a copy." "You'll have it by morning," he said. She nodded once, clipped and certain, the way she did everything. Then she looked at him one more time, a look that had several layers and was moving too fast through them for him to catch all of them, and she walked toward the north entrance to meet Pharaoh. Cole stayed where he was. Around him, the plant's emergency protocols continued their organized activity. Crew head counts, equipment status checks, the arrival of the county fire unit that came to a stop in the north lot with its lights turning. Kevin walked over and handed Cole a cup of coffee from the break room thermos he'd apparently grabbed on his way out, and Cole took it because it seemed like exactly the right thing to accept in this moment. "Nice call on the relief valve," Kevin said. "Nice execution," Cole said. Kevin shrugged. "I've been here 18 years. I know what a bad reading sounds like." He paused. "Just no one usually makes me do anything about it." Cole drank the coffee. It was bad. The break room coffee was always bad. And it was hot. And it tasted like the best possible version of itself standing in a Montana parking lot in January at 1:30 in the morning with hydraulic fluid on his boots and an adrenaline hangover settling into his bones. He thought about Ellie asleep at home. She was home tonight. He'd arranged a later pickup. She'd be in her own bed with the nightlight in the hall and the spare key under the mat, the way they always left it. She would wake up in the morning and make herself cereal and watch 20 minutes of cartoons before the bus came, and she would not know that anything had happened tonight, and that was exactly the way he wanted it. He finished the coffee and handed the cup back to Kevin and went to find a pen because he had a report to write. It took him 2 hours. He wrote it at the break room table in the building's intact south wing, where the lights were still on and the heat still worked, and everything was almost normal if you didn't look toward the north corridor. He was thorough and specific and chronological. Times, readings, exact locations, the sequence of decisions, and why each decision was made. He included his analog gauge readings alongside the digital monitoring readings. He included the failed request to recalibrate the sensors from 14 months ago. He included Gary Britton's name and Farrow's name and the date of the maintenance request that had been declined and the language of the decline. He was not angry while he wrote it. He was just thorough, which was a different thing and a more useful one. At 3:45 in the morning, before he clocked out, he emailed the report to Vivian Hale's corporate address, which Priya had quietly passed him on a slip of paper while the emergency services were wrapping up their assessment, without being asked to, which told Cole something about Priya that he filed away favorably. He CC'd his own personal email because he'd learned a long time ago that documents had a way of disappearing into organizational systems when the contents were inconvenient, and because keeping your own copy was not paranoia, it was just reasonable. Then he clocked out, walked across the parking lot to his dented F-250, and started the engine. The drive home was 20 minutes of empty road and still cold air, and the particular quiet of the hours between night and morning. He didn't listen to the radio. He drove and watched the road and let his mind do what it did in the aftermath of things. Not replay, not analyze, just settle, the way sediment settled when water stopped moving. He thought about Junction 6 and the sound it had made. He thought about Kevin opening the relief valve at 60%. He thought about 12 people from Section 7 standing in a parking lot they hadn't expected to be in tonight, alive and intact, and probably unaware of exactly how narrow the margin had been. He thought about Vivian standing against the wall in the red-lit corridor with hydraulic fluid on her heels and a notebook still in her hand saying, "That's twice," with the specific flatness of a person doing emotional arithmetic they hadn't budgeted for. He pulled into his driveway, sat for a moment. The house was dark except for the nightlight in Ellie's window, that small amber glow that meant she was there and she was safe, and the world was the manageable size it became when you were 7 and asleep in your own bed. He went inside, checked on her without turning on any lights. She was on her side, one arm over the edge of the bed, her breathing slow and even, and completely unconcerned with the things the night had asked of her father. He pulled her arm back up onto the mattress and pulled the blanket up to her shoulder and stood there for just a moment. Then he went to bed. He didn't dream about the plant. He dreamed about nothing, which was sleep doing its job. What he did not know, could not know, lying in the dark with the adrenaline finally draining fully out and the ache in his shoulders announcing itself again, was that Vivian Hale was not sleeping. She was in her hotel room in Dillon, laptop open, the maintenance logs that Priya had found spread across her screen in a way that told a story so clear and so damning that it almost didn't need the report Cole had emailed at 3:45 in the morning. Almost. The report closed the last gap. The report gave her exactly what she needed to take the next step. She read it twice, the way she read everything important. The second time through, she was making notes in the margin of her paper notebook. the handwriting growing smaller and faster as it always did when she was working through something that mattered. Outside her hotel window, the Montana sky was beginning the slow process of lightening in the east, the darkness thinning from black to a deep blue gray. The temperature had dropped further overnight. The parking lot below was glazed with new ice, quiet and still. Vivian turned back to her screen. There were going to be conversations tomorrow. Today, technically, in a few hours, that certain people in this company were not going to enjoy. She'd known since the server room with Priya that those conversations were coming. Cole's report had simply given her the last piece of what she needed to make sure no one could argue that she was wrong. She picked up her phone and sent 3 messages to 3 different people. And then she closed the laptop and went to stand at the window for a moment, looking out at the ice-glazed parking lot and the lightening Montana sky. She thought about a man standing in a red-lit corridor with an analog gauge in his hand and a completely steady voice, telling her where to stand so that the ceiling wouldn't hit her. She thought about 18 months, about the specific patience that required, the specific kind of person who kept filing the same reports into the same silence, not because they expected anything to change, but because their name was on the reports and they weren't willing to pretend otherwise. She turned away from the window and got 2 hours of sleep, because 2 hours was enough and there was work to do. The call came at 7:40 in the morning. Cole had been awake for 40 minutes, had slept 5 hours, which was more than he'd expected and less than he needed, and had gotten up when his body decided it was done regardless of what his mind wanted. He was standing in the kitchen in a t-shirt and jeans, watching the coffee maker do its slow work, when his phone buzzed on the counter. The number was a Denver area code he didn't recognize. He answered it. "Mr. Maddox." A man's voice, smooth, practiced, the voice of someone who spent his life on calls like this one. "My name is Richard Caulfield. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Hartwell Manufacturing Corporate. I'm calling regarding the incident at the Dillon facility last night." "All right," Cole said. "I want to be clear that we take safety incidents extremely seriously, and we appreciate the swift action taken by our night crew." A pause, calibrated. "That said, we're in the process of conducting a full assessment of last night's events, and there are some questions about the sequence of decisions made during the incident. Specifically, the unauthorized shutdown of the primary production system." Cole poured his coffee. "It wasn't unauthorized," he said. "Emergency shutdown authority for maintenance personnel is in Section 12 of the Facility Operations Manual. I've got the page number if you want it." A brief silence. "The question isn't about the technical authorization," Caulfield said, adjusting smoothly. "The question is about the judgment involved. The preliminary assessment from plant operations suggests that the system was experiencing normal operational variance and that the shutdown may have been premature, potentially causing the Section 6 failure rather than preventing a larger one." Cole put his coffee cup down on the counter. He stood there for a moment looking at us. "Who put that assessment together?" he asked. "That's still being determined." "Was it Farrow?" "As I said, that's still... because Farrow was on the radio telling me to stand down while I was reading 43 over ceiling on an analog gauge," Cole said. "And the Section 6 junction failed 12 minutes after I pulled the shutdown, with the pressure already dropping because of the manual relief valve. If the junction had failed at full system pressure, with no relief in process, the corridor failure would have been significantly worse." He picked his coffee back up. "I can walk you through the timing if that would help." Another silence, longer this time. Caulfield was not a stupid man. Cole could hear him recalibrating in the quiet. "There's going to be a formal review," Caulfield said. "Standard procedure for any incident of this nature. In the meantime, the company would like you to take administrative leave while the review is conducted." Cole absorbed this. Administrative leave was the corporate version of being set on a shelf. Technically not fired, technically not anything, just removed from the situation while people above you decided what story they were going to tell. "How long?" Cole said. "That depends on the review. Likely 2 to 3 weeks." Cole thought about his mortgage. The county roadhouse didn't have a mortgage, it was a rental, but the rent was due on the 15th and he had 11 days. He thought about Ellie's school lunch account, which he'd meant to refill this week. He thought about 2 to 3 weeks of half pay, which was what administrative leave paid at Hartwell, and what that meant against the specific arithmetic of his life. None of that changed what he was going to say. "All right," he said. "You'll receive an email with the formal notification within the hour," Caulfield said. "The hour," Caulfield said. We ask that you not enter the facility during the review period. Understood. And Mr. Maddox. A pause, and in the pause, Cole could hear the thing that Caulfield almost said, which was something like, be reasonable about this, or something like, we're trying to handle this properly, or something like, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Whatever it was, Caulfield seemed to decide against it. Thank you for your cooperation, he said instead. The call ended. Cole stood in his kitchen with his coffee and the particular morning quiet of the house. Ellie was still asleep. It was barely 8 o'clock. She didn't need to be up for another half hour. The refrigerator hummed. The coffee maker clicked as it finished its cycle and switched to its warming element. He drank his coffee. He was not surprised. He'd known, somewhere in the practical part of his mind that dealt with how organizations actually worked, that this was a possible outcome. That the morning after an incident would find the relevant parties busy building their version of events, and that his version, which had the disadvantage of being true, but the further disadvantage of pointing at people who'd been at this company for decades, was going to encounter some resistance on its way to becoming the official record. He'd kept his copy of the report. He'd emailed it to Vivian. He'd done what he could do with the things available to him. He went to check on Ellie. She was awake but horizontal, which was her default morning state, lying in bed with her eyes open, the specific paralysis of a child who was conscious but had not yet committed to the day. Her room was warm. The nightlight was still on, pale against the morning light coming through the curtains. Dad, she said without moving. Yeah. Is it a school day? Wednesday. She considered this. Can we have eggs? We can have eggs. He made her scrambled eggs with cheese and put toast on the side, and she ate it at the kitchen table while he sat across from her with his second cup of coffee, watching her and not thinking about Caulfield or Farrow or the Section 6 junction or any of it for 15 minutes, which was all he let himself have. Then he walked her to the bus stop in the cold, watched the bus take her, and went home to figure out what to do next. The formal notification email arrived at 8:57. It was 3 paragraphs, corporate legal in its language, careful about what it said, and more careful about what it didn't. The subject line read, Administrative Leave, Pending Incident Review. It was signed by Caulfield's office and copied to HR and to Gary Britton. Cole read it once, forwarded it to his personal email, and closed his laptop. He spent the morning doing the things that needed doing, regardless of what was happening at Hartwell. He split wood for Mrs. Paulson, which he'd been meaning to do for a week and now had time for. He checked the furnace filter at her place and replaced it with a spare he had in the truck. He stopped at the hardware store in Dillon for the filter and for a bag of road salt for his driveway, and he ran into Kevin in the parking lot. Kevin was in his truck, apparently just sitting there. He rolled down the window when he saw Cole. You here? Kevin said. About the leave? Yeah, this morning. Kevin shook his head slowly. They're saying you caused the Section 6 failure, that the shutdown triggered some kind of pressure surge in the secondary line. That's not what happened, Cole said. I know that's not what happened, Kevin said. I was on the radio. I heard your readings. He looked out the windshield for a moment. Farrow's been in since 6 a.m. 2 people from corporate flew in this morning. They've had the Section 6 corridor locked down since before shift change. Cole nodded. You doing all right? He asked. Kevin looked at him like that was a slightly surprising question. I'm fine, he said. Why? Because you made the call on the relief valve, Cole said. And now there are people from corporate walking around. I just wanted to know if anyone had given you any trouble about it. Kevin was quiet for a moment. Not yet, he said. If they do, Cole said, you opened that valve because a certified maintenance technician told you there was an analog reading 43 over ceiling and the automated system wasn't responding. That's in my report, and it's time-stamped. You were following the correct protocol. Kevin looked at him. You wrote that in the report? Specifically, Cole said. Kevin nodded slowly, processing something. Nobody's ever... He stopped. Started over. Most people around here, they write the report so it covers themselves. You wrote it to cover the people who listen to you. Cole didn't know what to say to that, because it seemed like a strange observation about a very basic thing. He said it was accurate, because that was the only version of it he understood. He bought his road salt and drove home. The second call came at 2:15 in the afternoon. This one he almost didn't answer. The Denver area code again, different number. He picked up on the fourth ring. Cole, Vivian's voice, clipped, private, not the CEO on the record voice. I have 20 minutes between calls. I need you to know what's happening. He sat down at the kitchen table. All right. Caulfield called you this morning. At 7:40. I know. I didn't know he was going to do that before I knew he'd done it. There's a distinction there that matters. A pause. He could hear background noise on her end. She was somewhere busy, not her hotel, maybe an office or a conference room. Farrow and two of the senior executives have put together a preliminary incident report that places the causation of the Section 6 failure on your decision to shut down the production line. They're framing the analog gauge reading as a misreading by an unqualified technician. Cole was quiet for a moment. Unqualified, he said. You are technically classified as a maintenance mechanic, not a certified pressure systems engineer, she said. That's the argument. That your read of the situation exceeded your designated competency level and constituted overreach. He thought about this with the same quality of attention he'd given everything else about this situation. Without anger, because anger was still not useful, and without surprise, because surprised was not something he had room to be. What does your read say? He asked. My read says the maintenance logs, the denied recalibration requests, your 18 months of reports, and the fact that 12 people went home safe last night are not compatible with the story Farrow is telling. A brief pause. But I need time to build that case formally. The board review is in 9 days. If I move against Farrow and Caulfield and the senior executives before I have everything in order, they'll fracture it, challenge the documentation, question the chain of custody on Priya's data pull, make it about process rather than substance. I need 9 days. And during 9 days, Cole said, I'm on administrative leave. Yes, she said. It cost her something to say it plainly. He could hear that. I can't undo the leave without triggering the exact confrontation I'm not ready to have yet. I'm sorry. He was quiet. Cole. Her voice was different on his name. Not softer exactly, but less processed. I'm not going to let them write the story the way they're writing it. I need you to trust that. He thought about trust. He thought about what it meant in the specific context of a person who had every institutional reason to manage this situation in the way that protected the institution. He thought about 2 hours of sleep and a paper notebook. He thought about the way she'd looked at him across a red-lit corridor and taken 3 steps back when he'd asked her to. I hear you, he said. Is there anything you need? Financially, I mean. The leave is half pay and I understand that might… I'm fine, he said. A pause. You're not going to tell me if you're not fine, are you? I'm fine, he said again, which was both true and not entirely true in the way that most honest statements were. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite frustration, somewhere in between. 9 days, she said. 9 days, he said. The call ended. Cole put his phone on the table and looked at his hands for a moment. The knuckles, the small scar on his left index finger from a piece of equipment he'd handled carelessly 11 years ago, the grease that still lived in the creases of his palms, no matter how well he washed. Working hands, the hands of a person who fixed things. He got up and went to make lunch. Well, the 9 days were the specific kind of long that came from having nothing to do that you were actually supposed to be doing. Cole was not a person built for stillness, not for enforced stillness, anyway. He could sit quietly by choice, could be patient in the way that his particular training had required, but being told to stay away from a situation that was actively in motion while people he didn't trust were shaping the version of events, that sat in him like a stone. He found things to do. He fixed Mrs. Paulson's back door, which had been sticking in its frame all winter. He reorganized the maintenance items in his truck bed. He went through Ellie's winter clothes and found 2 pairs of jeans she'd grown out of and bagged them for the church donation bin. Then remembered the donation bin was at the church and drove past it, leaving the bag on the covered porch of the secondhand store on Main Street instead, where they had a drop-off box. He took Ellie to the library on Saturday, where she spent an hour in the children's section and came out with 4 books about animals and a look of complete satisfaction. They got hot chocolate at the diner on the way home, and she told him about a project she was doing at school about the water cycle. And he listened to the whole thing with the genuine interest he always had in whatever she was currently absorbed by, because she explained things with a directness and logic that he found genuinely engaging. "Dad," she said, stirring the last of her hot chocolate, "are you not working right now?" He looked at her. She was watching him with the careful expression she used when she was asking something she'd been thinking about for a while. "Taking a little time off," he said. She considered this. "Did something happen at work?" He thought about how to answer that accurately without telling her anything that was going to worry her. "There was an incident at the plant," he said. "Something I had to handle. Now there's some paperwork to sort out." "Are you in trouble?" "No," he said. And then, because she deserved more than that, "Some people are saying I made a wrong call. I don't think I made a wrong call. There's a process for figuring out which version is right." She held this. "Did people get hurt?" "No," he said. "That's actually the reason some people are saying I made a wrong call. Because nothing bad happened. It's easier to argue that nothing bad was going to happen." Ellie turned her hot chocolate mug in a slow circle on the table. "That's dumb," she said, in the tone she used for things that were self-evidently wrong. "Yeah," Cole said, "a little bit." She nodded once, firmly, as if the matter was settled, and went back to her hot chocolate. Cole looked at the snow falling outside the diner window and thought that 7-year-olds had certain advantages in how they processed things that the rest of the world spent a lot of energy complicating. On the 6th day, Gary Britton called. Cole was in the driveway checking the tire pressure on the truck when the phone buzzed. He almost let it go to voicemail. He answered it. "Cole." Gary sounded tired. Not the strategic tired of a man managing an impression, actually tired, the kind that lived behind the eyes. "I wanted to talk to you." "All right," Cole said. A long pause. "The report you filed," Gary said. "The one you sent to the CEO's office." "Yes." "Did you think about what that was going to do?" "Not to the company. To the people here. People who've been here 20 years. People who have families." Cole kept his voice even. "I documented what I observed and what I did, and why. I documented decisions that were made by people above me that I believe contributed to a dangerous situation. That's what a maintenance report is for." "You name me," Gary said. "You declined 2 recalibration requests," Cole said, "with your name on the declination emails. I cited the source documents." Another pause, longer. "I was following direction," Gary said, and there was something in his voice underneath the managed surface. Not quite guilt, not quite justification, something that lived in the uncomfortable space between the two. "Pharaoh wanted costs controlled. The monitoring system showed normal. I wasn't—" He stopped. "I wasn't trying to put anyone in danger." Cole stood in his driveway with the cold seeping through his jacket and thought about what he wanted to say to that. "I know," he said finally. "I don't think you were. But the result of the decisions you made, regardless of the reason, was that a system that needed inspection didn't get inspected for 18 months. And last Tuesday night, 12 people were standing in a parking lot at 1 in the morning because that system failed." He paused. "I'm not trying to end your career, Gary. I'm trying to make sure the record is accurate." Silence. "They're going to try to fire you," Gary said. His voice had changed, quieter, the managed surface gone. "Caulfield and Pharaoh. The board review is in 3 days. They're going to argue you caused the Section 6 failure and recommend termination for cause." "I expected that," Cole said. "And you're okay with that?" "No," Cole said. "But expecting something and being okay with it are different things." Gary was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said, and then he stopped. Cole waited. "For what it's worth," Gary tried again. "The Section 7 crew, Mike, the guys who were in there, they know what happened. They know why they're still going home to their families." "I appreciate that," Cole said. Gary hung up. Cole put his phone back in his pocket and went back to the tires, because they still needed checking, regardless of everything else. The board review was on a Thursday. Cole wasn't there. He hadn't been invited, which was consistent with being on administrative leave and also consistent with being the person whose conduct was under review. He was at home at 10 in the morning, helping Ellie practice her spelling words at the kitchen table when Priya called. Not Vivian Priya, from her own cell phone. "It's happening," Priya said. She was whispering, which meant she was somewhere she shouldn't be making this call from. The review started at 9. Pharaoh and Caulfield presented their version first. The board asked questions. Ms. Hale presented for the last 40 minutes. Cole set down the spelling list. And? She had everything. The original maintenance logs, the recalibration request denials with the approval chains showing who signed off on them and at what level. The monitoring system calibration records going back 4 years, Priya had found those in the second server pull, which showed 2 instances of deliberate recalibration to narrow the acceptable variance range, making the readings look cleaner than the system actually was. She had a cost-benefit analysis that Faro had submitted internally 15 months ago, recommending against the sensor replacement on the grounds of expense, with a note that the monitoring system would continue to show normal. Cole heard Priya take a breath. She had everything, Cole. Every piece of it. He was quiet. She also had your report, Priya said. She read sections of it aloud. The parts where you described what you saw, what your readings were, what you decided, and when. She read it in front of the full board. He thought about that. About his words. The flat, specific, time-stamped words he'd written at a break room table at 3 in the morning, being read aloud in a boardroom in Denver by a woman in a charcoal blazer. How did the board respond? He asked. I don't know yet, Priya said. She's still in there. I'm outside the conference room. A pause. But the way the board chairman was looking at Faro and Caulfield by the end of Miss Hale's presentation, I've been in a lot of rooms, Cole, and I've never seen anyone look at someone like that. He thanked her and ended the call. Ellie was watching him from across the table with the expression she'd developed for moments when something important was happening that she didn't have full information about. Everything okay? She asked. Working on it, he said. Let's do the spelling words. She accepted this and picked up the list. Vivian called at 2 in the afternoon. Cole was outside stacking Mrs. Paulson's wood. He'd been at it for an hour, the repetitive physical work of it, the clean, satisfying weight of each split log, doing the thing that outdoor physical labor did for him when his mind needed somewhere to put itself. It's done, she said. He set down the log in his hand. What does done mean? Faro is out, she said, effective immediately. Caulfield has been placed on probation pending a full audit of his role in the monitoring calibration decisions. The board wants to determine how far up the approval chain those decisions went before they finalize his situation. 3 other senior executives who were involved in suppressing the maintenance escalation are being reviewed. She paused. The board has formally cleared the Section 6 incident. The determination is that the shutdown was appropriate, the call on the relief valve was appropriate, and that the Section 6 failure, while significant, was a consequence of the pre-existing system failure that you identified and had been documenting for 18 months, not a consequence of your actions. Cole leaned against the woodpile. The cold was in his face and his hands, and it felt clean, the way cold felt when you'd been working in it. The administrative leave is rescinded, Vivian said. Your employment status is fully restored with back pay for the leave period. All right, he said. A brief silence. You're not going to say anything? She said. What would you like me to say? I don't know, she said, and she sounded genuinely uncertain, which was not a quality he'd heard in her voice before. Something. This is... Cole, they were trying to fire you. For cause. They were going to terminate your employment and put their version of events on the record and make it stick. I know, he said, and you're just... She stopped. He could hear her working on something. When I called you 6 days ago and told you I needed 9 days, you said I hear you. You didn't ask me to prove it. You didn't demand anything. You just said I hear you, and then you went on with your life. There wasn't much else I could do, he said. Most people, she said, would have done something, gone to the press, contacted a labor attorney, made noise, made it difficult. Would that have helped you build the case? Silence. No, she said. It would have muddied it. Then it wasn't something I was going to do, he said. The woodpile was solid against his back. Above the tree line to the west, the sky was doing something complicated with the late afternoon light, the low January sun hitting the underside of a cloud formation and turning it a dull orange gold. He stood and looked at it without particularly thinking about it. I'm going to be in Dillon next week, Vivian said. There's a lot of work to do at the facility. The Section 6 corridor needs full assessment and reconstruction. We need an independent pressure systems audit of the entire plant, and we need to hire for the positions that are now vacant. She paused. I'd like to meet with you. Not as an HR matter, as a conversation. About what? About what comes next, she said. For the facility. For you. I have some thoughts. He picked up the log he'd set down. I'll be here, he said. I know, she said. And something in the way she said it was different from the brisk efficiency of everything else she'd said on this call. Not personal exactly, or perhaps exactly personal, and she was still deciding how to say that plainly. He went back to the woodpile. Stack by stack, log by log, the work of it steady and real in his hands. He thought about next week and what a conversation meant when the person asking for it had just spent 9 days building a meticulous case while he stacked firewood and drove his daughter to the library and checked tire pressure. He thought about the kind of person who did that, who carried the weight of it quietly and precisely, and without leaking any of it into the part of her voice that people could hear. He thought about Ellie asking if he was in trouble and him saying no, and then trying to explain that expecting something and being okay with it were different things, and how he'd been honest about both parts of that. Mrs. Paulson appeared at her back door and looked at the woodpile with the expression she wore when she approved of something but wasn't going to make a production out of it. You want coffee? She called. Please, Cole said, and kept stacking. He didn't know what Vivian had in mind for next week, or what a facility looked like after the people who'd been running it badly for years were gone, or what his own role looked like in whatever came after. He didn't know those things the way he'd never known the shape of anything until he was standing in it. But he'd go to the conversation. He'd listen the way he'd listened in Section 4 when she'd asked him what he needed to prove the calibration issue, directly, without managing the answer. And whatever she said, he'd give her the same thing back. Mrs. Paulson came out with 2 mugs and stood beside him in the cold, and they drank coffee next to the woodpile, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was exactly right. Vivian arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week the junction had failed, though Cole only noticed that later and wasn't sure it meant anything. He'd known she was coming. She'd texted the night before, no preamble, just, Dylan tomorrow. Available afternoon if that works. He'd replied, works fine. And that had been the extent of the logistical conversation, which suited them both, he suspected. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. A conference room maybe, somewhere in the facility, some version of a formal meeting with an agenda, and perhaps someone from HR sitting in a corner with a notepad. That was the shape this kind of thing usually took. Instead, she showed up at his house at 2:15 in a rental car that was smaller than the Escalade she'd gone off the road in, parked behind his truck in the driveway, and came to the door in jeans and a heavy wool coat, the kind of coat that meant she'd learned something about Montana weather in the past 2 weeks. He opened the door before she knocked because he'd heard the car. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a brief moment in which neither of them quite knew what register they were operating in. Not office, not emergency, something they hadn't had a template for yet. You found it okay, he said. GPS, she said. Eventually. She looked past him into the house with the kind of open curiosity that people either had or didn't. Not intrusive, just genuinely attentive. Can I come in? Sure. The kitchen was the first thing she saw, because the front door opened directly into it. Small table, 2 mismatched chairs, the coffee maker on the counter, Ellie's spelling list still on the table from the morning. Cole moved the spelling list and gestured at a chair, and she sat down without any of the performance of sitting, just sat, the way practical people did when they were somewhere unfamiliar and were okay with that. Coffee? He asked. Please. He made it. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, the backyard was still winter-stripped, the bare trees along the fence line, a rusted bird feeder that he kept meaning to fix. She looked at the yard while the coffee brewed. Ellie's at school, he said, not because she'd asked, just because the house had the particular quality of a place that was usually occupied by more than one person and currently wasn't. How old is she again? 7. Vivian nodded. She was looking at the spelling list she'd moved to the edge of the table, reading the words without making a show of it. He poured the coffee and brought both mugs to the table and sat across from her. The facility, she said. It wasn't a segue. It was where she'd been going all along, and they both knew the conversation had started already. The Section 6 reconstruction is going to take 6 to 8 weeks. The independent pressure systems audit starts Monday. I brought in a firm from Salt Lake City that has no prior relationship with Hartwell. The sensor recalibration you requested 14 months ago is already done. New junction couplings throughout sections 4, 5, and 6 are scheduled for next week. He drank his coffee. Good, he said. She looked at him. You're not going to say I told you so? No. Most people would. I'm not trying to be right, he said. I was trying to make sure the system got fixed. If it gets fixed, that's the outcome I wanted. She held her mug in both hands and looked at him with the look she'd used in Section 4 the first night. Evaluative, yes, but also something else underneath it. Something that was trying to decide what category he belonged to. He got the sense she'd been trying to decide that since a blizzard in January. I want to talk to you about a position, she said. All right. I'm creating a new role, Director of Safety and Operational Integrity, reporting directly to me. It would cover all Hartwell facilities, not just Dillon. There are 4 plants. The role involves developing and enforcing safety protocols, conducting independent operational reviews, and having direct escalation authority to the CEO's office that bypasses plant management. She set her mug down. No more reports going into a drawer, no more recalibration requests sitting on someone's desk, because fixing the problem costs money that affects a quarterly number. Cole was quiet for a moment. That's a significant change to how this company operates, he said. Yes, she said. Ed, it is. People who've been here a long time aren't going to like it. Some of them aren't here anymore, she said, and the ones who are will adjust or they won't. That's going to be true regardless. The question is whether the structure is right, and I believe this structure is right. He thought about 4 plants. He thought about what it meant to have authority that was real rather than procedural, the kind that didn't evaporate when it encountered someone who'd been somewhere longer. He thought about 18 months of reports, and what 18 months of reports felt like from the inside. Why me specifically? He said. It wasn't false modesty. It was a genuine question, and she knew the difference. Because you spent a year and a half doing the right thing in a system that was actively designed to make the right thing feel pointless, she said. Because when the Section 6 junction was building toward failure, you didn't call a meeting. You didn't send an email. You did the specific correct thing in the specific correct order, and 12 people went home. She paused. And because you know what it's like to be the person in the plant that nobody upstairs is listening to, which means you'll actually listen to those people when you're the one upstairs. Cole looked at his coffee. I'm a maintenance mechanic, he said. I know what you don't have on paper, she said. I also know what's not on your paper. She said it evenly, not as a revelation, not as a card played, just stated, the way you stated a fact that was relevant and both parties might as well know we're working from. He looked up. The military record, she said, the parts that aren't in your personnel file. I didn't dig, Priya didn't dig, but I've met people who have that kind of gap in their history before, and I know what it usually means, and I know what it tends to produce in a person. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to tell me anything. I'm telling you that I'm not hiring the paper version of you. I'm hiring the actual version. It was the most directly anyone had said that to him in a long time. He wasn't sure what to do with it, which was a feeling he was less comfortable with than blizzards or failing pressure systems. There would be a salary attached to this, she said, and named a number. Cole put his mug down. He stopped. Appropriate for the responsibility, she said. And I'm aware of what you've been earning and what your life costs. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm paying for what the work is worth. He thought about Ellie and the hamster question and the fish that had died and the lunch account and the rental house with the furnace that he kept running on his own because it was easier than asking the landlord. He thought about those things for exactly the amount of time it took to acknowledge them and then put them away, because they weren't the reason he was going to say yes or no. I'd want to keep the Dillon facility as my primary base, he said. Ellie's in school here. I'm not moving her. The role doesn't require relocation, Vivian said. Travel, yes, but home base is wherever you are. I'd want the escalation authority to be explicit, he said. In writing, not a general principle. Specific language about what I can bring directly to you and when, and an acknowledgement from the plant's management teams that that channel exists. Already drafted, she said. I'll send you the language this evening. He nodded slowly. The bird feeder outside the window caught the light, rotating slightly in the wind. He really did need to fix that bracket. He'd had the part for 3 weeks. Okay, he said. Vivian looked at him. Okay? Yes, he said. I'll take the position. She didn't celebrate it. He appreciated that. She just nodded once, the way she processed decisions, fully and then forward, no lingering. They sat in his kitchen and drank their coffee, and she told him about the audit timeline and the reconstruction plan and the personnel reviews still ongoing in Denver, and he asked specific questions and she gave specific answers. And it was the most functional professional conversation he'd had in a long time. And also something else that neither of them named, which was fine, because some things named themselves eventually without being pushed. Ellie came home at 3:45. The bus dropped her at the end of the county road, and she walked the quarter mile to the house the way she always did, backpack bouncing, reading a book while she walked, which was a habit that had given Cole several premature gray hairs in the past year, and which she refused to stop because she'd calculated, very seriously, that the road had low traffic and good sight lines, and she was perfectly capable of looking up when necessary. She came through the door and stopped. Vivian was still there. They'd been talking for almost 2 hours, and the coffee had been refreshed once, and at some point Cole had put a plate of crackers and cheese on the table because it was that kind of afternoon. Ellie looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Ellie. Cole watched both of them do this. "Hi," Ellie said. "Hi," Vivian said. "I'm Ellie." "I know. I'm Vivian." Ellie came to the table, dropped her backpack on the floor in the specific way that Cole had been asking her not to drop it for 2 years, and helped herself to crackers without being invited, which was her house and her crackers. She looked at Vivian with the direct assessment that children used before they learned to disguise it as something more polite. "Are you from work?" Ellie asked. "I am," Vivian said. "Are you the one who figured out my dad was right?" A brief pause. Cole opened his mouth and then closed it, because there was nothing useful he was going to add to this. "Yes," Vivian said. "That's a fair way to put it." Ellie ate her cracker. "He filed reports for 1.5 years," she said. "He didn't tell me that, but I heard him on the phone." "Ellie," Cole said. "I'm not saying anything wrong," she said, with the particular dignity of a 7-year-old who knew she wasn't. She looked at Vivian. "He doesn't complain about stuff. He just keeps doing it anyway. That's what he always does." Vivian was quiet for a moment, and something in her expression had shifted. Not the composure breaking, more like the thing underneath the composure being briefly visible. "I know," she said, and said it to Ellie rather than to Cole, which was the right instinct. Ellie appeared satisfied with this. She took another cracker and got down from the table to retrieve her backpack. "I have homework," she told the room generally, and went to her bedroom, pulling the door mostly but not entirely shut behind her, the way she always did. The kitchen was quiet. "She's remarkable," Vivian said. "She's a handful," Cole said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." She smiled. Not the small involuntary smile from the blizzard cabin. Something more open than that, less guarded. It changed her face in a way that was not unpleasant to look at. He smiled back, which was not something he'd done much in this kitchen. Spring came to the Bitterroot Valley. The way it always came, late, reluctant, and then, all at once, the snowfields retreating up the mountain slopes and the scrub along the highway going from gray to a tentative green over the course of about 10 days in late March. The light changed first, that was always the first sign. The way the afternoon held on an hour longer than it had the week before. The Section 6 corridor at Hartwell Manufacturing was reconstructed and fully operational by the second week of March. The independent audit had concluded in mid-February, a 600-page report that documented not only the pressure system failures, but a pattern of deferred maintenance across 3 of Hartwell's 4 facilities that had been ongoing for between 8 and 14 years. The report was submitted to the relevant regulatory bodies. The company faced significant penalties. Vivian had not tried to mitigate those penalties by managing the report's findings. She had published the full document internally and made its executive summary available to the workforce at all 4 plants, which was not what companies typically did, and which told the 230 people in Dillon something about who was running things now. Cole started his new position on March 1st. The first thing he did was request a meeting with the night crews at all 4 facilities. Not the managers, not the engineers, the night crews. The people who were in the building when nobody from corporate was watching, who knew exactly where the systems were stressed and where the reports went to die. He flew to 3 of the 4 facilities in the first 2 weeks, sat in break rooms and on loading docks and in maintenance bays, and listened. He asked specific questions and wrote down specific answers in a notebook he'd bought for the purpose. Not a tablet, a notebook, because he'd noticed what Vivian used and had decided she was right about the advantages of it. What he heard at those facilities confirmed what the audit had found and added texture to it. Particular systems, particular histories, particular people who had been trying to say something for years and had learned to stop trying. He wrote it all down. He sent Vivian a summary after each visit, no editorial, just facts and observations and what he thought needed to happen next. She responded to each one. Not just an acknowledgement, actual responses, specific to what he'd written, with follow-up questions that showed she'd read it rather than skimmed it. They had a rhythm to their communication that had developed without being designed, efficient and direct, the way communication worked between people who didn't need to perform anything at each other. The third facility he visited was in Wyoming, outside of Casper. He flew up on a Wednesday, spent 2 days, and was at the airport on Friday afternoon waiting for his connection back to Bozeman when Vivian called. "How was Casper?" she said. "Cold. The loading dock crew there hasn't had a proper inspection of the conveyor drive systems in 4 years. I found one that had been jury-rigged with a piece of plate metal and a bolt that wasn't rated for the torque load." "How is it that every facility has a version of this story?" she said, not rhetorically. She was genuinely asking, working through it. "Because the version that gets approved is always the version that doesn't cost anything," Cole said. "And the people who fix things with what they have are good at their jobs, so it mostly works, until it doesn't." "Until it doesn't," she repeated. "What do you need to address the Casper situation?" He told her. She listened and asked 2 questions and said she'd authorize the work order by Monday. Then she said, with the brief gear shift that he'd come to recognize as her moving from business to something adjacent, "Ellie's science project, did she finish it?" He'd mentioned the water cycle project in passing 3 weeks ago, when they'd been talking about something unrelated and Ellie had interrupted the call with a question about evaporation. "Finished it last week," he said. "She got an A-. She's extremely irritated about the minus." "What did the minus come from?" She labeled the condensation arrow wrong. She maintains the teacher's rubric was unclear. "Was it?" "Honestly, a little bit." Vivian laughed. He'd been hearing that laugh for about 6 weeks now. It came out when she wasn't monitoring herself, which was increasingly often in conversations with him, and it was a different sound than her professional register, rougher and less managed and more real. "Tell her I said an A- on a water cycle project is a solid performance," Vivian said. "She'll say she wanted an A." "Tell her so did I, for most of my academic career, and I survived the deficit." He smiled at the airport ceiling. "I'll tell her." In April, Vivian established the Hartwell Safety Innovation Scholarship, a fully funded annual award for students pursuing engineering or physical sciences degrees, open to children of current Hartwell employees. The amount covered 4 years of tuition at any accredited university in the country. The first recipient was announced in May. Ellie Maddox was 8 years old and technically ineligible by several years, which Vivian had known when she announced the scholarship, and which Ellie had pointed out immediately upon learning about it, with the specific exasperation of a person who felt the universe had poor timing. But the scholarship would be there when Ellie was ready for it. That was the point. The afternoon the scholarship was announced company-wide, Cole was in his truck in the Hartwell parking lot, having just come from a walkthrough of the newly installed sensor array in the primary production wing. He read the announcement on his phone and sat with it for a minute. He thought about what it meant to build something for a future you couldn't see yet. Not a monument, not a statement, just a structure that made it slightly more possible for the next person to do the right thing. A scholarship. A recalibrated sensor. A maintenance protocol that had actual teeth. A reporting channel that led somewhere real rather than terminating in Gary Britton's inbox. Small things, structural things. The kind of things that didn't make news and didn't produce a moment that anyone would point to later as the turning point. They just made the turning point slightly less necessary because the slow drift toward disaster had been interrupted at a lower level. He'd spent his military career doing work that operated on the same principle. Not the dramatic intervention, but the quiet professional competence that meant the dramatic intervention was less often needed. He hadn't always succeeded. He'd been in situations where the structure failed and the human cost was real and permanent and not something that got fixed in the next chapter. Those situations lived in him the way they always would, not loudly, but present, part of the material he was made of. What he'd learned from those situations, The thing he hadn't fully articulated until he was sitting in a Montana parking lot in April reading about a scholarship was that the work was always worth doing, even when it disappeared into the system without acknowledgement, even when the reports went to a drawer, even when someone decided it was more convenient to pretend the sensors showed normal. You did it because your name was on it, and your name meant something, and the only version of yourself you could actually live with was the version that didn't pretend otherwise. Ellie had said he just keeps doing it anyway. That's what he always does. She'd said it to Vivian, not to him, the way children sometimes said the truest things about people to someone who wasn't the person. He thought she was right. He thought that was probably the best thing about him, and also the thing that had cost him the most, and that those two facts were not contradictions, but aspects of the same thing. He started the truck and drove home. The conversation he and Vivian had been not quite having since January had, by May, begun to have itself without either of them forcing it. It wasn't a dramatic progression. There was no single moment. There was a phone call that ran 2 hours past what either of them had scheduled it for. And at some point in the second hour, they were no longer talking about Hartwell. There was a Saturday in April when she was in Dillon for a board follow-up, and she'd come by the house afterward, and Ellie had recruited her into helping with a jigsaw puzzle of the solar system, and Cole had made dinner. Actual dinner, not crackers and cheese, and the three of them had sat at the kitchen table until 9 o'clock, and none of it had felt like anything other than exactly what it was. There was a walk they took along the county road one evening in early May, the light lasting long enough now to make an evening walk possible, the air carrying the first real warmth of the year. Ellie was with Mrs. Paulson. They walked without deciding to walk, just ended up outside and moving, the way things happened when you stopped needing to plan them. "Can I ask you something?" Vivian said. "Yes," he said. "That night in the cabin, when you told me your name and said you worked maintenance at Hartwell, you saw something in my face. I know you did. I felt you see it." He thought about how to answer that. "Something moved," he said. "You covered it fast." "Did you know what it meant?" "Not at that moment. I filed it away." "And later?" "When I found the company announcement in my email," he said. "You were already the CEO. You'd known who you were talking to in that cabin the moment I said the company name." She nodded. They walked. The gravel on the county road crunched under their feet. "I should have told you," she said. "You had a head injury and hypothermia," he said. "You get some latitude." "The morning," she said. "After. I should have said something before. Vivian." He said it the way he said things he meant, directly and without extra weight. "You were the new CEO conducting a facility review. I was a night shift mechanic who'd pulled you out of a ditch. There wasn't a simple way to say that. I felt like I owed you a warning," she said, "that you were walking into work that morning without knowing who I was." "I figured it out," he said, "because you're annoyingly good at figuring things out." He looked at her sideways. She was watching the road ahead, but the corner of her mouth was doing the thing it did. "You had your own situation to manage," he said. "You were walking into a facility with entrenched problems and entrenched people and a board review 8 days out. Announcing yourself to the mechanic you'd met in a snowstorm wasn't the priority." "It should have been," she said quietly. He let that sit for a moment. The road curved ahead, and beyond the curve the land opened up toward the mountain range, still carrying snow on the high slopes, the white peaks against the early evening blue. It was the kind of landscape that made you feel small in a way that was mostly a relief. "You paid it forward," he said. "That's how I see it. You couldn't warn me that morning. So you spent 9 days building a case that cleared my name with evidence instead of asking for good faith. I'll take that trade." She looked at him. I was aware, standing on a gravel road in Montana with the mountains at the end of it, that this was the kind of moment that he used to not quite believe in. Not because it was perfect, because it wasn't. Both of them were too complicated for perfect and too old for it to seem appealing anyway. But because it was real. The road was real. The cold that was still in the air despite the warmth of the day was real. Vivian, standing beside him with her coat and her notebook in her coat pocket, always the notebook, was real. "I grew up in Ohio," she said, which seemed like a non sequitur and wasn't. "Not much in the way of mountains." "I noticed," he said. "You dressed for Montana wrong when you went off the road." She gave him a look. "I dressed for a 2-hour drive in a heated vehicle." "Which worked until it didn't." She shook her head, half exasperated, but the other half of her expression was something warmer than that. "You're very annoying," she said. "I've been told," he said. They walked back to the house in the long May evening light, side by side on the gravel road, and neither of them said anything that needed to be said out loud just yet, because some things built themselves at their own pace, and the pace was right. By summer, the Dillon plant had been certified by an independent body as meeting the highest operational safety standards in its industry classification. It was the first Hartwell facility to receive the certification and the first in its region. The announcement ran in the regional business press, with a photograph of the facility and a quote from the new CEO about the company's commitment to operational integrity. Cole was not in the photograph. He did not give a quote. "I was in the plant that morning, walking the Section 6 corridor, fully rebuilt, new sensors, new couplings, the overhead ductwork properly secured to proper brackets with a torque spec that he'd personally verified, and making notes in his notebook about 2 things he wanted to have looked at before the next quarterly review." Kevin found him in the corridor at about 9 in the morning, which was unusual because Kevin worked nights and tended not to be around at 9 in the morning unless something was happening. "You see the announcement?" Kevin said. "I did," Cole said. "They mention the night crew anywhere?" "They mentioned the workforce broadly," Cole said. "If you want, I'll send Vivian a note asking for a more specific acknowledgement in the internal communications." Kevin waved this off. "I don't need a mention," he said. "I was just asking." He looked at the corridor, the new paneling, the clean overhead ductwork. "Looks different in here." "Looks like it's not going to kill anyone," Cole said. Kevin nodded. He looked at the corridor for another moment, then looked at Cole. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said. "Section 7. Those 12 guys. None of them knew how close it was. They went home that night and had dinner with their families, and they didn't know." "Yeah," Cole said. "You think that's better or worse? Not knowing?" Cole considered this. "I think it doesn't matter which," he said. "They went home. That's the part that matters." Kevin stood there for a moment. He was a man who didn't speak unnecessarily, which Cole had always respected, and he seemed to be deciding whether what he wanted to say was necessary. "Thank you," he said, "for the report. Writing what you wrote about the relief valve, the way you wrote it." Cole looked at him. "You made the right call," he said. "That deserved to be documented accurately." Kevin nodded once and left. Cole went back to his notebook. Ellie turned 8 in June. Her party was small, 4 friends from school, Mrs. Paulson and Vivian, who drove up from Denver specifically for it because she'd been asked, and the asking had surprised them both. Ellie not seeming to think it was a particularly large thing to ask, and Vivian finding, upon being asked, that she did not want to say no. The party involved a store-bought cake that was supposed to look like a space station and approximately resembled one if you didn't look too closely, a backyard full of the controlled chaos of 8-year-olds, and the hamster that Cole had finally agreed to, which Ellie had named Newton, and which lived in a cage in her room and occupied roughly 40% of her mental bandwidth. At some point in the afternoon, Cole found himself standing at the edge of the backyard with a piece of cake, watching the chaos, and Vivian appeared beside him with her own piece. "You made this look easy," she said, meaning the party. "I've been doing kids' parties solo for 5 years," he said. "There's a system. There's always a system with you." "That's not a criticism?" She considered. "It's an observation," she said, with some admiration in it. He ate his cake. She ate hers. In the middle of the backyard, Ellie was showing her friend something about Newton, with the focused intensity of a person who believed in the inherent interest of what they were explaining, which was, Cole thought, one of the best qualities a person could have. "She's going to be something," Vivian said. "She already is something," Cole said. Vivian looked at him. There was something in her face that she wasn't quite managing, and she didn't seem particularly interested in managing it, which was its own kind of development over the past several months. "Yeah," she said. "She is." There was a point, Cole thought, in the middle of a summer afternoon with cake on a paper plate and a yard full of children, and the mountains in the distance still holding their last snow on the high peaks, where you could either notice what your life had become or keep looking past it toward the next problem to solve. He'd spent a long time looking past it. Looking past had been how he'd gotten through the hard years, the years after the military, the years of figuring out who he was without the structure that had defined him, The years of raising Ellie alone in a rented house and filing maintenance reports into a silence that never answered back. But hard years ended. Not with a ceremony or a clear marker. They just ended, the way seasons ended. Not all at once, but in increments. Until one day you were standing in your backyard in June, and the light was warm, and the person beside you was someone who had written things down and built cases and driven up from Denver for a birthday party, and your daughter was explaining hamster behavior to her friends with complete authority, and the thing you'd kept filing into the silence for 18 months had been heard and acted on and made real. None of it had been easy. The blizzard hadn't been easy, the 9 days of leave hadn't been easy, the years before that certainly hadn't been easy. But somewhere in his understanding of how things worked, Cole had never quite believed that easy was the point. The point was whether you kept doing the right thing in the gap between the action and the outcome. When nobody was watching and nothing had been resolved yet, and the reports were still going into the drawer, you did it because your name was on it. And sometimes, not always, not as often as it should be, but sometimes, someone came along who was paying attention. Ellie ran over, breathless, cake on her face. "Dad," Newton got out of the carrier for a second, and Madison screamed. "Is Newton okay?" "Newton's fine, Madison's fine. It was a whole thing." She looked at both of them with the comprehensive assessment of a child who was monitoring the adults in her environment. "You have cake on your shirt," she told Vivian. Vivian looked down. She did in fact have cake on her shirt. "That's fair," Vivian said. Ellie seemed satisfied with this response and ran back into the chaos. Vivian looked at the cake stain and then at Cole, and then she laughed. The real laugh, the unmanaged one. And he laughed too, which was something he was doing more of lately without particularly deciding to. The afternoon held. The light stayed long, the way summer light did in Montana, generous and unhurried, stretching across the valley, and the mountain slopes and the factory lights that were beginning to come on in the distance as the second shift arrived, the plant running its evening cycle, the sensors reading what was actually there, the reports going to people who would actually read them. Everything was imperfect. The house still had a corner of the kitchen that got cold. The F-250 needed tires. Vivian lived in Denver, and that was a complicated geography. Ellie was going to have opinions about Newton's habitat requirements that were going to cost money. The other 3 Hartwell facilities still had problems that would take years to fully address. And there would be days when the work felt like trying to turn a ship with a paddle. None of that was a reason to think the thing hadn't been worth doing. Cole stood in his backyard in June with cake on a paper plate and looked at his life. The actual shape of it, the specific and imperfect and ongoing thing that it was. And he found it was something he could stand in without looking past it. That was enough. That was in fact more than enough. The factory lights came on across the valley, steady and warm, and the evening